Jean, thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for inviting me to share my current research. So, try to organize things like this. I'll first start with two ethnographic vignettes, as we call them in anthropology. That means an anecdoto. A few days ago, Ethnos newspaper published an interview with the Minister of the Interior. The journalist reported that at one point the minister got up from his chair and fetched from his office cupboard the police file of Alice Velouchiotis, the legendary communist hero of the Civil War, and read from its time-worn contents to sustain the argument he was having with the journalist. That file was part of the police archives that belonged to the police surveillance files saved from the 1989 expiatory flames, and we'll come back to this, and kept under secret until May 2016, that is last spring, when the same minister declared that these documents were now being released to become archives available to historians. And he, quoting from an interview he gave to the Stathmos στο Κόκκινο on 29th May. The second vignette is about my old times fieldwork in Corfu, actually. So, reading the interview, it triggered a memory from this first experience of public archives in Greece, where I combined ethnographic work in the village with archival research in the town. The material conditions, the dampness, the cold, the dust, the archaic filing system that gave little information about the contents were all exotic to the newcomer. Then culture. The janitor, one of the sweetest men I have ever worked near, explained to me that certain files were kept incommunicado for as long as they were in use by a certain professor in Salonika University. So they were kept apart, ready for him to work on during his summer visit. As time went by and winter came, my apprentice status gradually evolved. I was allowed to occasionally accompany Mr. Yannis, the janitor, to fetch or put files back in their shelves in the basement rooms, and sometimes hold his ladder against the high shelves. One day, as he was pulling a bulky file from the church series, Ecclesiastica Archia, έγγραφα, an egg fell and splashed on the floor. "Oh, poor little hen, silly little hen, what a pity you lost your egg. You gathered nobody would come around here, eh?" So we found the broken glass pane in one of the basement windows, and Mr. Yanni made a note to report this to his director, the only other employee of Corfu Archives. My Corfu observation contrasted with other experiences of archives. My one-day exposure to municipal archives I had visited with my PhD class in a small town near Paris, and with my later and much longer experience at the Public Record Office in London, which allowed me my Corfu fieldwork, which followed, my Corfu fieldwork. What I had perceived as exotic, as the exotic element in the Corfu case, obviously did not concern the content, since the documents I worked on, like the annual agricultural censuses and the parish registers with the births, marriages, and deaths I found about the village I was studying, were relatively easy for me to handle. nor did it concern the poor material conditions inside the derelict archival building. Nothing to do, of course, with today's brand new facilities at Paleo Frurio and, of course, with appropriate archivists. Archivists? I don't know. It was something about the social culture that I had to understand. What were the social relations that one could observe inside the Corfu archives? What was the relationship between the two members of staff, and none of them professional archivists, and the public? The archives functioned very much like other public administrations in Greece, where relationships between civil servant and citizen or / visitor were less a matter of rules and regulations than a local situation where social status, established according to wider social categories and rules, was the pivotal element. In these conditions, the quality of personal relationship was a matter of establishing some degree of mutual trust between the researcher and the civil servant responsible for giving access to the archives. The outsider was a stranger, a visitor, who would be admitted inside by the keepers of the place, in the manner of the Mediterranean hosts. In other words, the two actors were bound by relations of consociation. That is the type of reciprocity to be found within social contexts of relative instability and precariousness. Crapanzano has underlined that in these types of concepts, reciprocal ties are subject to dissolution and therefore are constantly being renegotiated. So, I will focus this presentation on the use of archives by political players in post-1974 Greece. And my general context, the general context of this study, is the exploration of the relation between memory and history within Greek political culture, and more specifically, the stakes of this relationship within the conditions of the present economic and political crisis. I will try to show that the growing references to the 1940-1950 period is part of a more general phenomenon concerning the repositioning of Greek society towards its past, and more specifically towards the memory of the lived experiences of a generation that has just disappeared. The idea of the 1940s as metaphor or as template leads us to issues of memory, heritage, and intergenerational transmission of historical remembrance. I propose to ground my observations and comments on the fate of one specific type of archive, the corpus of the police files that was partly destroyed in 1989, which has been haunting the memory of the heirs until its recent reappearance in the places of power and government. These last developments raise issues of the respective place of political actors and of civil society in the management of places of memory. So, Pierre Nora made a classic distinction between memory and history, and according to that distinction, memory corresponds to a remembrance of lived experience, always changing, always plural, and is related to specific social groups, while historians' history is a learned construction of the past destined to become lasting knowledge. Thus, while memory is subjective, related to memories that survive within social frames, as Halbach's has been written, history presents itself as an objective interpretation of past events. Archives are the raw material of historical knowledge and historical remembrance. They are sometimes exhibited in places of memory, museums or memorials, but they can also be considered as constituting themselves a place of memory. As such, they interact with social representations, which include elements such as political concepts, narratives, shared cultural attitudes, and/or affect. Under this perspective, archives can be included in the study of social representations of the past. And I think a good reference of that kind of relationship is Papailias' work on archives. Archival practices are also connected to social and historical memorial practices and celebrations since the boom of memory studies in the 1990s, themselves related to the politics of commemorations and memorial building, especially of World War II and the Shoah. In France, for example, the grandiose celebrations of the 40th and 50th anniversaries of the invasion of Normandy by the Allies was a triggering circumstance. It was organized under the presidency of François Mitterrand in 1984 and 1994, and was attended by all heads of states of the 1945 anti-Nazi coalition. The Caen Memorial, a museum and research center, was inaugurated in 1986. So a condensation of that kind of event during that decade. In Greece, the triggering point was the fall of the military dictatorship in 1974, when the demand for history, for the understanding of the causes of these Greek tragedies of the 20th century, triggered new interest in historical and social studies. Almost concomitantly, the country joined the European Union, and the frontiers of these domains, historical studies and social studies, opened naturally towards the international scientific community. So, in the aftermath of the defeat of the communist-led forces in 1949, hundreds of those who had joined the important communist resistance movement directly experienced its extreme consequences. Death by execution, prison or exile in the re-education camps during the Civil War and in the years that immediately followed. Tens of thousands of citizens were identified as people from the wrong side and suffered from humiliations and milder persecutions. Communists and their families were then considered akin to traitors and as such were treated as second-class citizens. These hot Cold War conditions created a gaping divide between right and left that persisted until the fall of the dictatorship in 1974, when anti-communist legislation was first abolished. As will be discussed immediately below, the successive attempts at national reconciliation that took place since then were incomplete, as political leaders from all camps opted for forgetfulness, but refrained from assigning responsibility for the suffering. In other words, agents, and I'm quoting here the Convention of 1984 Convention of Human Rights, agents of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment went unidentified, unpunished, and or did not admit their deeds nor asked for forgiveness. Those conditions were not favorable for the production of historical knowledge according to the traditional definition of history. That is, as we saw, the objective interpretation of events. It is therefore useful to be aware of the political calendar when one examines the historical production on the 1940s, as well as the changing relations between history and memory. One can distinguish three major periods in relation to the memory of the Civil War. The first concerns the post-war years and lasts until the fall of the military dictatorship in 1974. It concerns the actors and witnesses generations, those who had been directly involved with armed conflict and its consequences to the civilian population, and who had personal memories of the period. The second period is the post-dictatorship period, also known as Metapolitevsi, which expands from 1974 to 2015. The third period began in January 15, when Syriza, a party overtly claiming communist heritage, came to power. So this is the periods. After the fall of the military regime, the heritage of the 1940s was being claimed by three political parties. Couroucli, the traditional pro-Moscow Communist Party of Greece; Couroucli Esoterikou, the smaller Euro-Communist Party, formed in 1968; and PASOK, the new Socialist Party, founded by Andreas Papandreou, who eventually came to power in 1981. Each of these three parties proposed a new narrative about the war and the civil war, associated to their different understanding of historical events and to the historical and commemoration practices. And I'm here referring to Maranzidis' quite recent work, 2010, on Demokratikos Stratos. During the last 40 years, all three political heirs of the 1940s, communist and pro-communist actors, Eamelas and Demokratikos Stratos Elados, have repeatedly modified their perspectives and repositioned themselves in relation to 1940s, founding moment of the Greek left. So the almost taking of power. The relative impact of these tendencies within public opinion has also varied over time, as Couroucli's positioning, for example, in the 1990s, has been gaining prominence among the post-2015 New Left political spectrum. In this sense, the different narratives concerning the controversial history of the 1940s decade, involving war, occupation, resistance, and civil war, have also been used as metaphors by leaders and activists in their effort to interpret the political stakes and challenges of the Greek crisis. Syriza's slogan, for one, Πρώτη φορά αριστερά, the left for the first time, for example, directly relates to the 1940s. And this unsuccessful attempt to take power and establish a socialist republic in Greece during the Civil War. Moreover, symbols from the 1940s gained prominence during Syriza's campaign for the January 2015 elections. The choice, for example, the choice of Manolis Glezos, a 90-year-old veteran and hero of the resistance against the Nazi occupiers, to lead the electoral list of the party, was a powerful move to occupy the symbolic place of memory representing the left's resistance during World War II. Similarly, national history of the war and civil war has gone through radical changes, dominated by the victors or the right-wing point of view during the first post-war years. The official narrative gradually allowed for the victim's point of view in the post-1980s period and ended up adopting the left historical narrative in the third period. These major changes were related to the important and rising historiographical production on the 1940s decades, especially since the 1990s, when archives from both Greek and foreign, German, US, British, and Soviet sources gradually became available for research. Thus, despite the rising number of professional historians working on the period, it quickly became apparent that historians themselves were taking sides, leaving little common ground to allow for scientific debates. The absence of national consensus about what happened during the 1940s has left national history in limbo, as historical truth about the Civil War continues to be a matter of debate among historians, political leaders, public intellectuals, and of course the general public. Now, I'm going to legislation matters. The abolition of anti-communist laws in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the military regime was followed by two important laws voted in the 1980s. The 1982 law, brought to the vote by the socialist government, concerned the requalification of national resistance as fighting against the occupying army in 1944. The law specifically redefines national resistance groups to include both communist and non-communist organizations, provides a list of those organizations in its Article 9, and fixes a national commemoration day, which was the anniversary of the Gorgopotamo sabotage common operation between British, Greek, and Greek guerrilla groups from both the communist and the non-communist organizations. Last but not least, the law gives veteran status and pension rights to all fighters within the ranks of those organizations. In 1989, the coalition right-communist left government brings to parliament another law. This is the Tsanetakis government, for those who remember, concerning the Civil War period under the title Abolition of the Civil War Consequences. This text defines the date of the Civil War from the retreat of the occupation armies, that is, different dates, from October 44 to later, until 31st December 1949, so we have the period. It abolishes all consequences, as it calls them, from earlier sentences concerning national resistance fighters, which is people that had been condemned, for example, to death in absentia, were no longer considered so, and extends pension rights of the 1982 law to veterans of the Democratic Army. It also defines procedures for the recognition of the quality of member of the Democratic Army. As mentioned earlier, the 1980s attempts at national reconciliation represented a radical change of the official narrative. The two laws addressed issues of political memory and social welfare and recognition. In 1982, it re-established the memory of the resistance from both communist and non-communist groups against the occupation forces, while the 1989 law went further by recognizing the Civil War as such, and by consequently recognizing the years spent by young men fighting this war as service, military service, to be taken into account for their pensions again. So the 1989 law decided for amnesty and amnesia at the same time. As it brought the law to Parliament, the government also organized the destruction of an enormous corpus of police files containing the details of the surveillance of thousands of citizens during the period spanning from the 1930s to the 1970s. Let me see, I think. The method chosen was symbolically important. The police files were to be consumed by fire all over Greece. In Athens, the operation took place under important media coverage at a steel plant near the capital, while other fires were lit in the provinces. The government's proclaimed idea was to abolish the chasmos, the division of the nation, by cancelling the past, as Kefalogiannis explained in a later interview in June 2003, cancelling the past. The destruction of the piles was met by unanimous approval by the political establishment of the time, right and left. The only dissenting voices came from historians who tried to convey that this decision would make it impossible for future generations to gain knowledge and understanding of national history. The political world had clearly chosen to refrain from entering the hard and painful process of identifying agents and establishing responsibilities for the suffering of the thousands of citizens who had been the victims of the Cold War repressive measures, especially the anti-communist laws. The only concession made to historians was a vague public promise to preserve a sample of these files for historians, as if a sample of the files was enough material for the scientists to work in their humanities laboratories on social conflict during the 20th century. Clearly, the political class was only concerned about social or national memory and refused to understand the historical stakes. That is, it refused to consider history as knowledge. Hence, despite the post-1974 change of the national narrative to include the memory of the people of the left, the political world continued to suspect and despise history as science. In 1989, the government therefore officially declared to opt for forgetfulness, lithi, against remembering, alithia, and consequently destroyed all proof of any bad deeds that had not already been judged. As Nicole Laurent has pointed out and has been quoted since abundantly in that kind of memory literature, in her analysis of the Athenian Civil War in 403 BC, this was the war before the Democrats and the oligarchs in Athens, they chose to choose lithi over alithia is the consequence of a two-step action taken by Athenian citizens to punish the 13 tyrants at the same time, and at the same time abandon charges against their followers by deciding not to remember the bad deeds, mi mnisikakin, so as not to remember the city's collective suffering. In Greece, it was, bad deeds were punished once and for all just after the Civil War, and then we just had to forget everything else. So during the 80s and 90s, archival institutions were more accessible to historians. At the same time, the World War II classified archives all over the world, as we said before, gradually became available and spurred more research on the period. In Greece, public archival institutions were renovated and new private archives were being constituted. Again, the need to know, to look for the truth about the Civil War was especially the case for the historians of the left. And the first example is the 1979-1980s, December 79, January 1980s publication of a series of Coucouet documents of the 1946-49 archive in possession of the Coucouet Esoterikou that was organized by Philippos Iliou, one of the leading figures of the left historical tradition. A year later, ASCI, Αρχεία Σύγχρονης Κοινωνικής Ιστορίας, opened to the public. The ASCI Foundation, which became a central place for historical research on the war, the Civil War, and post-war society was more immediately related to the 1989 destruction of the files and the actors' need to redeem the elements of their collective history. Philippos was one of the more vociferous opponents of this operation of burning the files. In 1998, so we're in the same period again, the Greek Army's Historical Service published their documents of the Civil War period, mostly concerning the military history of the conflict. So, I'm going now to look at my more anthropological part. The past as present. The presence of the 1940s memory in the political setting of Greece in crisis is to be related, in my view, to the gradual importance of the Greek historians' debate about what happened during the occupation and civil war since the late 80s, as well as to the proliferation of commemoration practices organized by the political heirs of the defeated of the civil war. And I'm not going to enumerate here all these new events and places of memory, but there are a few. So what is the context of this anthropological exploration? The general positioning of my take on the subject is constructed around through two concepts that I submit to your judgment and critique. The notion of uncharted past and of fragmented memory. The notion of uncharted past refers to recent historical events, the war and the civil war that followed it, that have not or not yet become part of national history. The concomitant existence in the public sphere of conflicting versions relegates these episodes within the all-encompassing realm of memory, as defined by traditional historians, in the antechamber of history, again, Nora. In this context, the uncharted past represents a vision of the past closer to memory, in the classical Nora or Halbachsian tradition, including both recollection and oblivion through a mechanism of selection between remembrance and forgetfulness. Memory is one process that has these both elements. Thus, uncharted past refers to a situation of national history in limbo, to the absence of consensus about historical facts or historical truth, to the vague and confused character of the aspiring master narratives, and the incommensurability of partial and partisan narratives associated to rare and inflamed public debates. The uncharted past is also related to a state of fragmented memory, reflected in partial or contradictory narratives shared within the family or among members of specific groups. The state of fragmentation of memory, of the memory field, enhances and sustains tensions among the different communities of memory. Silence memories and forgotten events correspond to real-life stories and episodes that, at a given moment and for different reasons, do not feed grand narratives. In France, for example, the dominant national narrative of World War II was built on the opposition between collaborators and members of the resistance during the German occupation, where the majority was represented as pro-resistance and a small minority as collaborators. This narrative persisted for decades before being seriously challenged and finally defeated by historical research and public debates during the 90s and 20s. I'm here referring to Rousseau especially and to Douzou. In Greece, post-war generations were brought up within the fragmented memory landscape, where family memory was often related to one of the two opposed master narratives, corresponding to the two sides which confronted each other during the Civil War, the victors and the defeated. Built and after the conflict, they were extreme and simplistic, maintaining the gap between privately shared family histories formed from personal memories handed down to descendants and public and political versions of national history. Similarly to what happened in France, the life histories of concrete people who were neither heroes nor bandits or fascists, depending on whose side the speaker was identifying with, were simply left out, as the two dominant narratives of the Civil War left little room for shades of grey. Fragmented memory is the flip side of the uncharted past, or the unfinished process of transforming social memory into national history. As national history of the 1940s decade remains controversial, even among historians, professional historians, there can be no single official narrative about the Civil War years, but a multiplicity of memories related to diverse groups competing for political and moral recognition. Fragmented memories are both public and private, as they are primarily connected to individual narratives of events and life stories shared in public or in private spaces. It's very much fashionable now to have oral history groups and that kind of activity in museums and memorials. Hence the national holiday, for example, celebrated on October 28 in every town and village, is a commemoration of the victorious Albanian epic, because it represents and symbolizes the unity of the Greek people. No other lieu de mémoire, place of memory, date or place related to the 1940s is officially celebrated on the national level. Finally, the Gorgopotamus was a wishful thinking. Nobody pays very much attention to that, and certainly schools are not led to any Gorgopotamus to have a look. Both memory and history are transmitted through narratives. People remember stories or fragments of stories related to experiences. Some participate in commemorations of historical events that also involved narrations of these past events and experiences. While memory is subjective, related to memories that survive within their frames, as we said before, history is presented as an objective interpretation of the past. So in Greece, the uncompleted process of this historiographic turn and the parallel existence of more than one versions of the history of the Greek resistance and civil war leaves room for partial, plural, and fragmented narratives of the past to thrive. They correspond to different communities of memory, as they have been called by Loring and Danforth and Ricky Boschoten, separately celebrating events or moments of history related to specific places. The notion of fragmented memory underlines the overwhelming presence of memory while the official history of the Greek Civil War is still in the making. As historians themselves were indulged in memory wars, as Fleischer has very vividly described, history's place was occupied by incommensurable, conflicting master narratives competing among themselves from within a mass of fragmented memories aiming to become history. In the absence of officially established history, the partiality and fragmentation of social memory has no pacifying effect. On the contrary, it keeps communities apart by maintaining the memory of the past outside the reach of critique and knowledge. Memory is selective, connecting specific past event to the present and ignoring others, and it cannot be relied upon to reconstruct the past, as Todorov has reminded us. Neither is it opposed to oblivion. Within each community, memory is the result of the interaction between forgetting and remembering, and in this sense it does not protect from ignorance of the past. So, the redemption of the lost files in 2016 and their presence in the minister's headquarters, still not in the hands of professional archivists, triggers my concluding anthropological questions that I wish to discuss with you tonight. Can one compare this episode, this 2016 episode, to the Corfiot experience of the late 70s? Does this mean something about the coexistence of codes of interpersonal relations and administrative regulations? Is it piosise that counts, or pianoise that counts in these relationships? And another question is about the public servant who acts as host or in command of the institution he is employed in. His position status gives him and his protégés, the visitor, for example, or his other protégés, access to resources which he can keep or share. Thank you very much.